And Bill S7, besides having the worst name that I've seen in a long time, it seemed like a comedy routine, right, to have this name come up. It feeds into narratives we're already seeing. So we saw in Edmonton, before this act took place, we saw bus ads in Edmonton and bus ads in New York that said, leave us alone safely. Is your family have a fuck on your head? Or things like, these are honor-killing victims, you could be safer. And they're like, literally, these are funded by anti-immigration organizations. So we have to think about where these laws are being based and who's pushing for this narrative that Muslim women don't need to be listened to. We need to be safe. That somehow the people know better for us. And this has been a narrative that's been ongoing pre-9/11 even. We saw that with, movies like Not Without My Daughter being produced. We saw that with conversations that were happening about Afghanistan. We see that continuously with certain communities, certain people speaking on behalf of our community, making assumptions that our communities are backwards. And I think what Christa, I don't keep referring because I was listening to the podcast actually this morning, but Christa brought up the idea that the word barbaric has been used for many, many different communities, but Indigenous communities have been called barbaric, right? And when people just don't bat an eye to this law, we're allowing for words like that to be used against communities that are very racist. And I don't mind saying the word racist because it is. And so for me with Bill S7, what we're seeing coming forward is we're seeing a redundant law. We're seeing a legislation come forward that actually will do more harm to communities than good. We're seeing changes to the criminal code that they're like, oh, now there'll be a peace bond. And how many of us in this room, we do practice family law, we do work with women that are survivors of violence. We know the restraining orders right now, they're like as good as sometimes the paper that they're written on. Right? And the same with peace bonds. And what makes me nervous about it, so you're gonna put forward that something, say, okay, I'm gonna be forced into a marriage, and I'm gonna be taken overseas. So I'm gonna put forward this peace bond, and then I'm gonna have to go stand in a court in front of my family and say that I'm unsafe. And we know that the young women that we work with have continuously said to us, I don't want to face my abusers at this time. I'm not in a space to do that, I just want to be safe. We don't have provisions right now in this new law to actually make young women feel safer. What it will actually do is make it unsafe. The other piece is that there will be a criminalization of anyone that participates knowingly in a forced marriage. So Deepa and I always ask this question, well, what does that mean? Like, who of all the people that participate in marriages, I don't know how many people have been to brown weddings, but there are a lot of people at my weddings. There are like 300 people. Are they all going to be charged? Is the person in the makeup artist going to be charged? Is my grandmother going to be charged? Who's going to be charged? And yes, you're right, there are multiple people often involved in family violence. We know that. We know that there's a web of folks that are involved in family violence. It's never one perpetrator. We need to change the framework that we look at violence against women to look at it like a victim perpetrator. We have to look at it from state to families, community members to family members. We have to look at that, yes. But this idea of criminalizing all up to 5 years, that will create a secrecy in the community that people won't go forward. The similar conversations have come up around female genital cutting. We see people not wanting to come forward around this. We have to create spaces where people can actually call in their families and do the work within their families. We have to learn spaces that people can do that healing. And I think it's like the conversation that we're seeing right now, even in the media, just this week, right? We saw conversations, there were so many articles about Muslim communities being the number one community that was against the sexual health education, right? And there was like that narrative of backwardness, right? And it's this idea that violence against women and consent culture is something that doesn't belong in our communities. And this law creates this idea that our communities are backwards, our communities are static, culture is static, and there's only one way to be Muslim, or there's only one way to be South Asian. And let me tell you, there's multiple ways. And we all know this. We know this from our experiences, our own families, our own communities. And what's heartbreaking to me is that Bill S7 will create a narrative in a space to which people have to adhere to it even within funding. So I can tell you that we were looking at funding proposals for the Canadian government. So any federal grants now include a blurb about barbaric cultural practices. So public health right applying for it, so they're watching public health for how long. But public health has a grant right now, and it's looking at violence in families, and they literally said like a big paragraph about barbaric cultural practices. If you want to look at that, and it was like female genital cutting, forced marriage, and honor-related violence. And so, again, taking it out of violence against women creates a narrative that this violence is something imported into Canada and it's something that's not faced here. That somehow immigrant communities, newcomer communities, brown and black folks are bringing this kind of violence to the country, as if this country isn't founded on violence against women. And it's very, very scary. In Bill S7 also, it talks about polygamy and says that polygamous marriages will be addressed within IRCA, which is the Immigrant Mission and Refugee Law. And what makes me nervous about this is, again, we've criminalized polygamy. It's not like something that hasn't been criminalized. It's been criminalized since the late 1800s. It hasn't been addressed, such as in Mattoo, which is a white community. Right? So why is it that that is even allowed to fester where children were trafficked and taken? We also know other communities like Left to War, which is an Orthodox Jewish community, which polygamy happened and forced marriage. So, sorry, just forced marriage happened. I don't want to put too much on them, but just forced marriage. But again, it's like when it happens in communities that it's convenient and fits into racist narratives, that's when we have to really think about why this is happening and what this law is about. With Bill S7 it will also look at, I get really angry, but upset too, right? But yeah, the other things that really upset me about Bill S7 is the marriage law. So again, so in Canada, before this bill was brought about, in different provinces, there was provisions that people could, even if you're under the age of 18, you could be married, and your parents were the ones that could consent to that marriage. So in this, when Chris Alexander, our Minister of Immigration, announced this, he was like, well, we want to end child marriages and forced marriages within immigrant communities, making the assumption that it happens only within immigrant communities, but this law, this marriage provision has been happening in Canada, right? So it's in Canada that this law exists. And so we've actually lowered it to 16, which actually isn't what the UN has said, which should be the universal marriage age, which is 18. So it's really interesting how we're seeing that play out. I think within Bill S7, what it will create more and more is an understanding within that violence in immigrant communities needs to be called something different than everything else. And to be safe, and I think Christa brought this up, I thought really eloquently. You said that to save the child, then we said save the child. Yeah, save the child, kill the Indian. And I think we can see that extension happening with Muslim and South Asian and racialized people, that we're seeing this happen where they're like, take out the Muslimness, take out the racialization, and you'll be safe. But when I talk to young women, and they sometimes we internalize, as people talk, sometimes we internalize messages. So I've had young women go to me, I'm only going to date white boys. I'm only going to date white people, and I'm like, really? Because they also violate folks, and we know this, and it's not a safe haven. And I think that what we are teaching people that's a safe haven, as if violence doesn't exist within communities. So, for me, what we're seeing is a continuation with Bill S7 of something that actually would be a redundant law, and not recognizing that within the criminal code, there are things like kidnapping, confinement, violence against children, neglect, trafficking. There are lots of things already existing in our criminal code that can address forced marriage and so-called honor-related violence, which, let's just be real, it's called violence against women or gender-based violence. And so we have to really look at that we already have those laws in place. We're just not using them. And when we are using them, we're using them in a way that actually doesn't support the community. We also see, one thing I would want to say too is that we also are seeing Muslim men, when they do go through the court system and being charged with domestic violence or being charged with violence against their children, we're seeing them get higher charges. And I think that goes across the board around seeing that people are getting higher charges and being seen as more dangerous, right? And adding that element in that they are somehow more of a problem. Also within Bill S7, one of the last things, and I know Deepa talks about this a lot, so maybe we'll find her a little bit later, but provocation, there was an assumption that the people won't be able to use the excuse of being revoked for using honor, right? But that hasn't been used by foreign defense. It's actually been used by the Crown to actually rationalize that. And I'll get deeper into that more later. But I think one of the things that, the last thing I'll leave you with is the idea, I have a good PowerPoint that I had for you. It's now up, but you don't need it. It's fine. This kind of criminalization of Muslim families and Muslim doesn't just stop with Bill S7. It continues with things like C-51, right? And so C-51 will be another way in which women will not feel comfortable within racialized communities, and specifically Muslim communities, to access services, to access the state, to use police, to talk to them. If you see police in your community, in your mosque, coming in, making assumptions about your community, harassing your brothers and dad, there might be already a fear that if my family's already being seen as this, or my whole community, because let's be real, if my whole community is seen as violent, barbaric, terrorist, all the names, all the words, then how am I going to feel comfortable actually getting the support that I need when violence happens? And this is something that I really think is serious. When I saw Omar Qatar come out this week, I don't know other people, but it was like, it was amazing. He was like a guy that looked like my brothers. And this is a state we're in right now. We're in a state where it is so hard. It is so hard because we want to name, like I work with, we have so many women come to our doors every week and they're experiencing violence. But this law will do nothing to end it. And when we see our state use our bodies as Muslim women to rationalize violence against our whole communities, or the way in which our stop immigration of our communities coming, or split up families, or somehow say that we're bad or we're wrong, what it does actually is just put it internal. And it doesn't allow us to actually reach out and support it. And so I really would say that if you're going to look at violence against women and start addressing it, one of the number one things I would ask you to do is talk about Islamophobia in your organization. How do you actually address it? How do you actually put into place the practice of anti-racism and recognize that there are voices of Muslim women that are doing this work, and recognize that we are doing it on the ground, and what we're not asking for is to you to tell us how we can be emancipated from our communities. We're asking actually you to listen to us and listen to the provisions that we need. Because what we need right now is support. We don't need people's support.